Welcome to the Soul Grit podcast. I'm Ann Taylor McNeese, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I also love Jesus, and I'm passionate about all things gospel and therapy. I created Soul Grit to be at the intersection of mental health and Christian faith. Christ followers need a place to ask questions and get answers about mental health. Join me as we dive into real stories and real questions from people who want to honor God with their hearts, souls, and minds. Hi, welcome back to the Soul Grit podcast. This is Ann, and I'm here today with Jeremy Williamson. Hi, Jeremy.
And it's so good to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
I'm excited about this. You actually approached me because you have a interesting story to share. I think the word story is in my mind because the company or organization that you work with is called Restory, correct?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And so we're going to learn a little bit about story. Now, this morning when I was driving my kids to school, my 13-year-old, who is an avid reader, writer, and illustrator, said, well, who's this guy that you're having on your podcast? And I said, well, he does work with story. And she's like, what's that about? And I said, well, there's a concept of like seeing your life as a story and being able to shape the different parts of your life. And then I got stuck and I was like, you know what? I'll tell you about it later because he's going to tell me on the podcast. So first of all, tell us about this work that you do with story.
Yeah. Thank you. So story, we call it story work. And the idea is that you and I are a story. Our life is a story. Our life exists in the context of a bigger story that we're a part of. And our life is sort of this collection of a bunch of little tiny stories and episodes that have all been sort of woven together for us to have become the people that we are today. And so when we think about the parts of our lives that aren't working well, the places where we feel stuck, or we feel like we have hangups or addictions or habits, unwanted behaviors, we take this approach of saying, well, we understand that we arrived here where we are today because of where we've been. And the way that we feel about our lives, the things that we believe about ourselves, those things are true because they became true somewhere along this journey that we have lived in. And so one way of thinking about story work is to think, and Dan Allender in some of his work uses this concept of like, I'm going to go on a walk with you into the deep forest of your soul. Mm-hmm. And as I'm sitting with people doing this work, to continue with Dan's allegory is like, we'll start off with like just walking on a paved road, somewhere easy. Yeah. And we may eventually find ourselves off a trail, just wandering into the wilderness of someone's soul and their story, mm-hmm. and understanding what happened there and what did they come to believe about their world and themselves as a result of their interpretation of what happened. Mm-hmm. And then how have they grown and developed habits and beliefs and behaviors as a result of all of that. So in the clinical world, I think we may be talking about something along the lines of like narrative focused therapy.
Yeah, I was going to mention it sounds a little bit like narrative therapy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We're talking about integration. So we're saying in story work, we're saying, hey, we exist a lot like the rings of a tree. Mm-hmm. There's this, you can't see it, but there's this massive old ancient oak tree that's right outside my window here. Okay. And if we were to be able to see the rings of that tree, we would see every year that tree has ever existed. And somebody who's really good at that work could take a look at each of those rings and understand, man, maybe this year there was a drought, or in this particular year there was a fire, or there was insect damage, or something mm-hmm. happened. But all of those rings still exist inside that tree. Yeah. So that tree still has its 1-year-old self and its 2-year-old self and its 3-year-old self all there. And whatever was true in that season of its life has affected its growth from that point until today. Yeah. And so we're almost like in story work, we're almost like these forensic, what's the word? Detectives of going back and kicking over rocks and understanding story so that we can understand today, so that the work of like integration and wholeness can happen in people's lives as they see themselves and their stories, hopefully in a restored, redeemed way.
Mm-hmm. And you told me that it's licensed therapists, it's spiritual directors, it's storywork counselors, coaches. Like it's a whole team of people working with this framework, right?
Yeah, that's right. We have a whole eclectic, really varied team that I love so much. I mean, we've got everything from like the really kind of nerdy therapists who like
hey.
are just oh, is that you?
Maybe.
And I don't mean to say that all therapists are nerdy by any means, but we've got like the really thoughtful and careful therapists. We've got like the hippies. We've got people who are really deep into spiritual direction. We've got storywork coaches. We've got former ministry people.
Yeah.
We've got people who work really well with people going through like faith deconstruction or doubt or
Good.
wrestling with those kinds of things as well. So really varied team with different disciplines and different practices for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I know one of the things that you bring to this team is your background in ministry and your former experience as a pastor. So tell us a little bit about how that life experience that you have shapes how you work with people now.
Yeah. I I knew really early on that I was supposed to be in some kind of vocational ministry. I didn't know what that was though. What I was feeling in my heart, I didn't hear a category for in kind of the structure of the church that I grew up in.
Yeah.
So I tried everything. I was a missionary for a while. I've lived in Latin America and in Africa, and I've gotten to be a part of work that's happening all over the world. I've been a kids pastor and a youth pastor and a senior pastor and a church planter and all the things. And all along the way, I was really aware of how difficult all of that was for me and how I found myself struggling and wrestling. And I always felt privileged in a weird sense to have survived and made it through a lot of difficult, horrible situations in ministry. And this sounds depressing. Ministry is awesome. And the men and the women who are working in churches and leading ministries are so incredible. And I came to realize at some point how much care we all need for our own souls.
Yeah.
In that deep calling. So I feel really glad to have had a pretty broad spectrum of experiences within the world that we just kind of label ministry.
Yeah.
And also I feel really, really passionate about ministering to those who minister and caring for those who care.
Yeah. I think you and I probably share that concern that people who are caring for the flock, as we say, they need their own care, because when they're not getting those emotional, mental, physical, psychological needs met, that's when damage tends to happen to those that they're shepherding. And so that I've seen that in my own life. In fact, the very first counselor that I ever went to was a pastor who ran a retreat center for pastors and their wives that were needing this kind of care. And so this has been on my radar since I was 18 years old, that somebody needs to be doing this work. And so I'm glad to hear that there's more than just this one guy doing that work. But I've seen personally in my own life when pastors are not getting the care that they need, or not, maybe even not being allowed the time that they need to be able to do that self-reflection and that digging in the dirt, as you're saying, right? And so tell us a little bit about how you might work with a pastor or a pastoral couple.
You know, the way that ministry happens in a lot of contexts today is a kind of a setup for a pastor to find himself isolated and lonely and burned out. And that's not a dig on the church at all. I love the church. But what many experience is the same thing that I experienced, in that, hey, here's a guy who's talented and he's his heart's beating and he's willing to do ministry and he can speak. So let's just put him up there.
Right.
And let him start going. And many people, when they think about a pastor or a ministry leader, they are thinking about what can be accomplished in the kingdom or what can happen in the church as a result of this person's input.
Right.
So, hey, we have a pastor and he's a really good speaker, or he's a dynamic leader, or he's a visionary. So we're going to, in a sense, consume him or allow him to be consumed, or to offer his life out and just pour out, pour out, pour out. And very rarely is there a posture from elders or church board or the church body. Very rarely is there a posture where they say, hey, this is a leader that we want to do life with, and we want to give him or her space to be human and to need and to wrestle and to be in all of that wrestling with us. Instead, what generally happens is we say, hey, here's a superhero. We're going to consume him till he burns out. We figure in, like, if he's a youth pastor, in about 6 months, he's going to be gone. If he's a senior pastor, maybe a couple of years, and then we'll consume the next guy to try to build this organization of this church. So to come back to answer your question, I find a lot of pastors and ministry leaders having bought into that narrative because it also works for us, because it's a place that we feel welcome and seen and delighted in. And that, don't we all want that? For me to, I was probably 15. I was 15 the first time I preached a sermon in a church. I was probably 14 the first time my pastor randomly from the stage, this is in front of hundreds of people, it was a big church, said, hey, Jeremy, I want you to come up here and just share what's on your heart, like randomly out of the blue. And I was here for it. I loved the opportunity, but that worked so well for me because my ache in my soul and my story was that I was felt unseen and abandoned and unchosen. So for me to be in a ministry situation where I'm doing good work, but also I feel valuable and chosen, and that happens because I lay my life down and burn the candle at both ends and do all these things. So eventually that narrative falls apart. Eventually it doesn't work because it's not the way we were intended to live. So I meet a lot of pastors and ministry leaders who are coming to grips with the fact that the way that they've seen themselves and their role in the kingdom is actually based on a narrative that's not true. To me, I think it is, when we think about offering care for people who are in ministry, it's not just about fatigue. And although I do sabbatical coaching and love sabbatical coaching, even that is not, it's not about fatigue. It's about where you've been and why you said yes to ministry 10 years ago and what that's cost you. And maybe what false personas that has invited out of you to sort of be who people need you to be instead of being who God actually made you to be. So I find us going all the way back to the little boy or the little girl who fell in love with Jesus and the man or the woman who said yes to ministry, and recentering ourselves back in those places.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, I'm really glad that you're doing that work. I just, like, as you're talking, I'm like thinking of people like, oh, I wish this person would talk to Jeremy, or, you know, even in my own practice, where sometimes I have a person who's struggling with some of the issues that you're talking about, and it may not be my specialty. Like, I do work with a lot of people in ministry because I have a lot of ministry experience myself, but I just like the nuance that you're bringing to this, of like understanding that your best work in the kingdom of God comes out of being exactly who God made you to be, not what everybody else needed you to be in that moment. Yeah,
that's well said. It's until we are at rest with our identity as a son and a daughter, a son in whom God is delighted, a daughter that God delights in. Until we're at rest in that, ministry can flow. Of course it can, but it will cost us too much. And I think it will be less than what God intended for it to be. But yeah, may we find ourselves as sons and daughters before we find ourselves as pastors and leaders and preachers and teachers and all that.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, so I just logistically, though, you're in northern Colorado. I'm in Southern California. I know as a licensed therapist, I can only see people in my state, but as a story work coach, you can probably see anybody from anywhere, right?
Yeah, that's accurate. And I have the privilege of getting to meet people all around the United States, all around the world. Um, and that is one of the benefits. The states have been really generous in opening up the possibility for coaching work to happen over state lines.
Yeah.
And so it means that there's some really important boundaries around the work that I do.
Yes.
Um, but it also means that people who, as I've heard you say in some of your episodes, people who don't need a diagnosis and they don't need therapeutic care. They
Mhm.
just need maybe a wise guide.
Mhm.
They need some coaching, someone to walk with them in this season of their life. I get to offer that, and I'm so glad to be able to do that.
Yeah, that's good. So I always want to bring that up because I think people will hear what we're talking about and think that it would be good for me or someone I know. And then, but how do I access that? So for those
Mhm.
listening, I'm going to be having all the links and everything in the show notes. And if you go on the website, you'll see Jeremy's profile, but also this whole team that we've been talking about that's able to offer some different nuances within the services. But if you've listened to the Soul Grit podcast for even one episode, you know my guests and I believe that when we integrate the power of God with the wisdom of modern psychology, we get supercharged healing, change, and growth in counseling. As a Christian therapist, however, I realize that there are many practitioners out there who are personally Christians but don't know how to integrate their faith into their counseling practices. That's why I created the e-course, Faith Integration for Therapists. In this premium 5-module course, therapists who love Jesus will learn everything from understanding their calling, to marketing their practices to Christians, to adapting evidence-based interventions to honor our faith. You can learn more about the online course at www.soulgritresources.com/courses and send an email to info@soulgritresources.com to receive a discount code. Shifting gears just a little bit, Jeremy. I know that you have a new course that you are trying to get the word out about. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about that for a minute.
Thanks. So along the lines of people that we sort of thrust into ministry, which, by the way, I don't necessarily have a problem with being just sort of like from one day to the next. If you read the New Testament, the book of Acts, all through the Gospels and the book of Acts, people were fishermen one day and preachers the next day.
You're an apostle now.
Exactly, like welcome. And that's great. And they had Jesus with them as an example, and they had his access to his wisdom and his care and everything that he brought. Whereas today, I think a lot of pastors find themselves not only lacking access to care for their own souls, but lacking access to maybe some information that would help them offer deep care to people who are in need.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a Pew Research study that was done pretty recently that said that over 20% of people who have like a significant issue and will eventually seek care from a professional psychologist or therapist, they talk to their pastor first.
Right.
Or they talk to their small group leader first, or the youth pastor, or someone from their church. And having been in that role,
Mm-hmm.
I have to tell a quick story here, actually. So when I was young in ministry, I did my rotations I was the pastor of the day. And I was like 20 something. And I was on staff at this church in deep South Texas, right on the border of Mexico.
Okay.
So I knew that the receptionist came back to my office and said, "Hey, Jeremy, somebody needs to talk to a pastor." It was my day. So I was so nervous. This guy comes back and we're chatting, and he actually just spoke Spanish. That's another reason why he ended up with me, because I'm bilingual. And so we're sitting there talking, and it turns out he's saying, I'm coming up from Mexico and I have to drive all the way to Wisconsin today. And I just need you to pray for protection over me. And I was kind of curious, and thankfully had at least the wherewithal to ask a question. And I was like, well, you seem really nervous for like a road trip. What's going on? Is there something else that's happening? And he says, he stops and he asks, like, how confidential is this? And I said, well, it's really confidential. You can share whatever you need to share. And he said, well, my van outside is loaded down with cocaine.
Oh
And
my gosh.
driving it up to Wisconsin today. I'm a drug mule. And I was
Oh my
like,
gosh.
okay, I don't know what to
They
say
didn't teach
right
me
now.
this in
They
seminary.
didn't teach me in seminary. And I know that's a really extreme example.
Yeah.
But how often do we have people who were in ministry and people come and say, I think I'm going to leave my wife.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm gay. I think I'm wrestling with this deep issue with my sexuality or with my heart, or I feel depressed, or I feel anxious, or I feel whatever. And we just, like, our training teaches us to fix that person,
Mm-hmm.
or to just pray for them, or to find like Bible verses from our Bible verse Rolodex and
Mm-hmm.
just try to offer something. When in reality, what we see over and over again in scripture is Emmanuel. We see God with us, God who offers his presence,
Mm-hmm.
God who offers strength and tenderness with us, and is not afraid to sit in the dirt with us in our worst moments. And so my colleague Chris, who's a licensed professional counselor, he and I developed this course for ministry caregivers, anyone who takes care of anybody in ministry who just needs some maybe structure and some understanding. How do I sit with people in my small group at church? What do I do when somebody comes to me with a big need that I don't know the answer to?
Mm-hmm.
And this course is kind of all about, like, you don't actually need an answer.
Yeah.
So here's some best practices. Here's some rules about mandated reporting when that becomes important as a minister. Here's, when it becomes important to refer out to a professional and how to develop those relationships. But even maybe the overarching theme is, here's how to just take a deep breath and sit in the dirt with people wherever they are and just relax, like just be offer kind presence. So that's what the course is all about. And we're so excited about it. Because hopefully people won't have to struggle like I did for years and years in ministry, not knowing what to do when people come with big needs.
And so you prayed for him and sent the cocaine on its way, huh?
Okay. So there were two things. He said I got to do a lot of work in northern Mexico in my youth, so I understood the cultural nuance behind this. But he asked that I would pray for the protection of La Santa Muerte, which is the saint of death, which in northern Mexico drug cartels is kind of a patron saint. And so I did take some time to explain why that wouldn't be appropriate, and that actually he can trust Jesus.
Yeah.
That in spite of the fact that he was running drugs, like, he was still God's son and still loved. And so I told him that I couldn't pray that the border patrol wouldn't find him, but I was happy to pray that he would have an encounter with God along the way. So that's where we left it.
Good job. Okay. Just wanted to hear the ending of that story. But so the course, though, is called Sitting in the Dirt, right?
That's right.
Okay. And you can find it on the Restory website, correct? Or does it have its own website?
No, you can find it on the website. If you go to the main menu, you'll see there's online courses is there, and it's called the Soul Care course. So Soul Care, Sitting in the Dirt. You'll find it right there.
Okay, perfect. So that link will be in the show notes. And I really I don't know if I mentioned this to you before, but like, my husband and I are small group leaders, and we have done the ministry of small group since before we were even married, since before grad school. Like, in college, we're the kind of people that are having people in our dorm room meeting for discipleship. And so this has been a huge part of our life. I mean, we've seen several different churches and the way that they train their small group leaders. And I love what you're doing, and I want to bring this to all the churches, because that what you said about the scripture verse Rolodex, like, here, like, you're going through something, let me look up topically what verse is about this. Oh, here's a verse on anger. Let me give you the verse that should fix you. Go have a good night,
Right.
That's not
it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And it's supposed to work, because we hear things like, the word of God is sharper than a double-edged sword, or it doesn't return void. And we don't actually see Jesus ministering like that. Right. Jesus didn't just sprinkle Bible verses. He offered his presence. And and I think,
well, you know what the law says. So, exactly. Like, he didn't have that approach.
No, he never did.
Yeah, well, and it's uncomfortable to sit with someone, like, when somebody dies, for example. Like, there's nothing that you can say in the moment that makes it better. but the ministry of presence and being able to sit even in silence, or, like that's just, it's hard, it's awkward, it doesn't feel good, it's uncomfortable. And yet people don't want to be alone.
I mean, we really believe that tragedy becomes trauma because of a lack of kind presence.
Yeah.
So in the absence of the presence of God, in the absence of the presence of strength and tenderness, tragedy becomes trauma. And so even the death of a person, you're sitting with people and maybe you're not saying much, but you're offering your kindness and your presence to someone who is gutted, they're devastated. Could it be that the nature of even the way that memory, that event is going to lay down in their brain, the way that it's going to affect their behavior for the rest of their lives, is being impacted by your simple presence in the room, by the kindness that you bring? That it's actually enough.
Yeah. That's hard stuff.
My daughter, a couple weeks ago, dislocated her foot playing volleyball.
Oh.
It was pretty gruesome. It was gross. And poor girl. And so we were in the hospital and her youth pastor came to visit. And I had so much compassion on him because when I was a youth pastor, I hated doing hospital visits. I was so bad at them. He did a phenomenal job though. And I congratulated him and I was like, hey, how awkward was that for you to just sit with us and not really know what to say? And he said the same thing. He's like, I hate it. He goes, I never know, like, if I'm going to overstep my bounds and say something I shouldn't say, or if I'm not saying enough. But I was just glad he showed up.
Yeah.
That's all we needed.
Yeah. And even if it's not like a gruesome situation like that, but it's like the sports, showing up for somebody's kid's game, like just somebody's new business opens and you show up, like just showing up is a big part of it, right?
Absolutely it is.
Yeah.
And that's what I love at the end of the day, is that Jesus said, when 2 or more of you are gathered in my name, like I'm going to be there in the midst of you. And in my practice, I believe that it is the presence and the truth of God that actually transforms us, brings us back to being the sons and daughters that we were meant to be.
Yeah.
And so we know, even when you're showing up at the football game, when you do that as an offering of like your presence and you're there because you're attuned and you care, presence of God is there with you as well, which is what we're all actually hungry for.
Yeah. Yeah. And that aligns with like my philosophy for counseling. Like every new counseling client that comes in, like I go through my informed consent and I tell them a little bit about me and my policies, procedures. And one of the things that I say to them is that it is my belief or my philosophy of counseling that growth and change happens in the context of relationship. And so that is what makes me motivated to be a very relational therapist. So I'm not stuffy. I'm not wearing elbow patches on my tweed jacket, or I'm not going to have like my computer open typing while you're talking, or even a clipboard. I'm going to be making eye contact with you. I'm going to be present with you in my person, because that's where I think the change starts to happen, when you have that presence. So thank you for that reminder that also when that happens, that God is there with us too. Yeah.
That's where the beauty happens. And you know that better than I do. Even the best therapies are designed to help us reconnect.
Yeah.
To help us be able to bring ourselves into a room and to be seen and to see. And I love that. I love how you said that. I'm not offended because I don't have any elbow patches on any tweed jackets.
You've got the nice Northern Colorado plaid flannel going on today.
There we go. Yeah.
Nobody's seeing us. We're not posting this, but nobody's seen that. But yeah. Hey, before we end the episode by asking Jeremy what he's doing for soul care, I want to let you know that Jeremy is offering us a 10% discount for Soul Grit listeners if you want to buy the course, Sitting in the Dirt. So make sure you go to the Restory website. And when you check out, type in Soul Grit, SOULGRIT, all one word, and you'll get 10% off. Send me an email if you end up purchasing the course. I'd love to hear how it's helping you serve those in your community. Now back to our episode. Okay, so Jeremy, I'd like to ask you the question I ask all my guests, which is, what are you doing for soul care?
Mm-hmm. Soul care for me is so important these days, every day.
Mm.
These days, I find myself stretched pretty thin. And that is between, I've got 3 kids and they're all athletes,
Mm-hmm.
and working for 2 different organizations under the same umbrella. But I find that for me to not buy into the narrative that my life exists to be stretched and poured out and consumed by people who want it, but that my life is a gift to God and it's something that I own. For me to be able to recenter in that are 2 things. I think you can see that your listeners can't see, but I've got this chair behind me.
Yeah.
And this is
really
big,
comfortable
leather chair. It's like an old man chair. I sit in my old man chair and I'm in the Word, and I sit silently in the presence of God. And I don't start a day without doing that. Generally, I don't want to lie on your podcast. Of course, I don't start every day without doing that, but I try not to start a day without doing that. The time of corporate worship for me on Sunday mornings is really, really important. And I feel it when I'm not there.
Yeah.
There's something about being in a space where I'm not the leader. And I am just a part of a body that's bigger than me. I think that's really important. And then I try to move my body. After almost every session, I'll stretch, and I'll generally pray like kind of a cleansing prayer and just center myself and stretch, move my body, to make sure that it continues to be well with me as I'm sitting with other people.
That's great. Thank you for giving us those reminders.
Oh, for sure. No, I appreciate the question. We all need to be reminded. We all need to be reminded.
And, every time I ask somebody, like there's some themes, like if you're a committed Christian, like you're going to have something about being in your Bible in there, but it's interesting to hear you say like the corporate worship and being in a body where you're not the leader is important to your soul. So I don't think I've had a guest say that before. So thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah. Okay. Well, everybody, we're going to have all those links. As I mentioned, it'll be in the show notes, and you can find out about the Sitting in the Dirt Soul Care course, how you can be able to sit with people when they're going through hard times, whether you're a ministry leader, small group leader, or just a family member, like anybody can use that. And then, if you'd like to get some coaching around story work or some counseling in this particular area, we'll have the link for that as well. So, Jeremy, thank you so much for being here.
It's such an honor, and thanks for having me.
The Soul Grit podcast is a production of Soul Grit Resources. You can find more at soulgritresources.com or on the socials at Soul Grit Resources. You can email me at info@soulgritresources.com.